Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of the 1960 triple murder in LaSalle County, Illinois? This case is the topic of an HBO documentary titled The Murders at Starved Rock. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll start with the background in this case, then I'll move to my analysis. On March 14, 1960, 3 women from Riverside, Illinois, which is near Chicago, checked into the Starved Rock Lodge in LaSalle County, Illinois. 50-year-old Lillian Oding, 50-year-old Mildred Lindquist, and 47-year-old Frances Murphy. They were visiting Starved Rock State Park to go bird watching. They were carrying a camera and a pair of binoculars. During the afternoon, they went on a hike to St. Louis Canyon, which is in the park. They never returned to the lodge. That night there was a heavy snowfall. The women were not reported missing until March 16. A search effort was initiated and their bodies were quickly found. All 3 women had been murdered. Their bodies were just inside a cave in the canyon. They were tied up with twine and some of their undergarments had been removed. They had been beaten with 3 different objects: a tree branch, their camera, and their binoculars. The police immediately suspected that multiple killers were involved. They believed that the perpetrators probably worked at Starved Rock Lodge, which was about a mile from where the bodies were found. They interviewed the employees at the lodge. Some of them said that they saw other lodge employees with the women. Some of them specifically mentioned that a dishwasher named Chester Weger had scratches on his face when he showed up for work on March 15, the day after the women disappeared. Chester claimed that he cut himself shaving, but his scratches were inconsistent with that cause. Twine located in the kitchen matched twine used to tie up the murdered women. Chester's leather jacket had blood on it, although the authorities were never able to determine whether the blood was from a human being. The police repeatedly interviewed Chester. They gave him multiple so-called lie detector tests. One of the reasons the police were so interested in Chester was that he was suspected of another crime that occurred in a state park a few miles south of Starved Rock in 1959. A man had attacked 2 teenagers, a male and a female, and committed an assault of a sexual nature against the female. Chester was identified in a lineup as the perpetrator. Chester was described as a quiet loner. In addition to being a suspect in another serious crime, Chester had a juvenile record. When he was 12 years old, he allegedly offended against an 8-year-old female. The offense involved sex. On November 16, 1960, Chester was once again interrogated. This time he confessed to the murders. The next day he participated in a reenactment at the scene of the crime. On November 19, he recanted. He said that he only confessed because he was threatened and beaten. Chester was indicted for the attack of the teenagers at the other state park and for the murder of Lillian Oding. The prosecutors were worried they couldn't get a conviction, so they wanted to save a couple of murder charges for the future if necessary. On March 3, 1961, Chester Weger was found guilty of murder. A month later, he was sentenced to life in prison. Chester maintained his innocence and went up for parole many times. He was repeatedly denied. But then, in November of 2019, he made parole and was released in February of 2020. Now moving to my analysis. At first glance, this case seems fairly straightforward. Chester Weger allegedly committed serious crimes in the past. He confessed, and there was other inculpatory evidence. As it turns out, many people were not convinced. In the 3-part HBO documentary on this case, we see that the community was very divided about whether Chester was actually guilty. The filmmaker, David Racuglia, was the son of one of the prosecutors in the case. Not the lead prosecutor, but still, his father played a significant role. This, of course, would introduce substantial risk that David would be biased. But overall, it appears as though David did a pretty good job. He did appear to be willing to believe whatever the truth was in this case. Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Chester Weger was guilty, starting with the inculpatory evidence. Chester Weger had the opportunity to commit the crime. He was an employee at the lodge where the 3 murders occurred. He had a history of allegations consistent with serious crime. He had scratches on his face that were inconsistent with shaving, which he claimed was the cause of the scratches. The twine in the kitchen where he worked matched the twine used in the crime. Chester confessed to the crime multiple times and even conducted a reenactment. He revealed that during the commission of the crime, a red and white airplane had flown overhead. He said that's why he pulled the bodies into the cave. He was worried that he was going to be spotted. The police checked, and there was a red and white airplane flying over the scene at around the time when the crime was committed. How did Chester know about the airplane if he was not there? After giving a confession, Chester had a hearing about its validity. He never mentioned being beaten, even though his attorney was there and he should have felt safe to talk about what happened. A physician testified that Chester had no signs of physical trauma. Chester's leather jacket had blood on it, which may have been human. Investigators said it looked like someone tried to wash the jacket. If Chester only confessed because he was a victim of intimidation or assault at the hands of the police, why didn't he mention the other perpetrators? It seems unlikely this crime was committed by one perpetrator. Most of the law enforcement officials involved believed there was more than one attacker. Chester's alibi was that he was alone in the basement of the lodge writing a letter to a woman, even though he was married. It sounds like Chester didn't understand what the word alibi meant. I guess he skipped the writing a good alibi class in school. Chester would later claim that he was at a barber shop, but no witnesses corroborated his story. Now moving to the exculpatory evidence. There were no witnesses to the crime. The blood on Chester's leather jacket doesn't make him look innocent, but there was very little blood on it. Based on the heinous nature of the beatings, the perpetrator would have been covered in blood spatter. Other people had access to the twine in the kitchen. Multiple hairs were found in a victim's hand and on a victim's glove. They did not match the hair of Chester Weger. The jury never heard about this because the prosecution did not turn over the evidence. This trial occurred before the famous 1963 Brady v. Maryland case, which requires prosecutors to turn over exculpatory evidence. One of the detectives, Bill Dummett, spent time at the airfield where the red and white airplane was stored. He could have known the plane was flying on the day of the attack and supplied that information to Chester. Bill was described as a corrupt police officer by other law enforcement officials. He was known to behave suspiciously. For example, he was secretive about his investigations. Chester accused Bill of threatening him with riding a thunderbolt unless he signed a confession. Bill could have been referring to the mythical deity Zeus or the electric chair. Given Bill's apparent level of sophistication, I'm going to guess it was the latter. Bill denied making the statement, but another officer confirmed that Bill did make the threat. Chester confessed that he acted alone. How did Chester convince 3 women to allow him to tie them up? One would think that as he was attacking one, the other 2 would have run away. In addition, 3 different objects were used as weapons: the branch, the camera, and the binoculars. Why would one perpetrator use 3 different objects? The prosecutor acknowledged that Chester's confession was not accurate. What's more, Chester's reenactment of the crime doesn't make sense based on the evidence. This doesn't necessarily mean he's innocent, but an accurate confession and reenactment would be more inculpatory than those that are inaccurate. Specifically looking at the reenactment, it's very difficult to believe Chester's story. Here's what he said happened. Chester claimed that he only wanted to rob the 3 women. He approached them and tried to steal what he thought was a purse, but it turned out to be a camera. He asked the women if they would walk further into the canyon to give him time to escape, like he was sorry that he tried to steal from them, but he didn't want to get caught. So he was really asking them to cooperate with his plan to get away. The women, for some reason, agreed to this. He followed them to an opening of a cave and then threatened them with a tree branch. He tied them up with the twine. As he was walking away, Frances Murphy managed to get free from the twine. She ran up behind him and attacked him with her binoculars. He once again retrieved the tree branch and beat Frances to death. He then went back into the cave and discovered the other 2 women were standing up, even though they were still tied with twine. They attacked him and scratched his face. Chester murdered them. He pulled the bodies into the cave after seeing the red and white airplane. He tried to make it look like the crime was related to sex to throw off the authorities. That's why he removed their undergarments. There are a few problems with this story. Most notably, it's clear that sex was the motive for this crime. He was lying about the robbery. The prosecutor actually believed this as well. Robbery was not the motive. As far as the last item of exculpatory evidence, the two detectives and former prosecutor Harlan Warren split the $35,000 reward for catching the killer. Harlan Warren built the case against Chester, but was voted out of office before the trial. When considering all the evidence, do I think Chester Weger was guilty? I believe that he was guilty in reality and guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, based on the standards of the time. But if he was tried, say, 30 or 40 years later, he would have been found not guilty. Everything really hinged on a confession, and the prosecutor admitted that Chester's confession would not be admissible these days. I do think there are some doubts in this case, like the involvement of a corrupt and substandard detective, but Chester's confession, along with the other evidence, is convincing. I think what really happened in this case is that Chester and a friend of his carried out the attack. Chester knew that turning in his accomplice would mean admitting guilt, and he really wanted to maintain his innocence. At least he did after he confessed. Moving on to my thoughts about the documentary, The Murders at Starved Rock. I'll go through some of the items in the documentary that stood out to me. Item number 1, as I mentioned, I thought that the filmmaker did a good job at trying to find the truth. There was the sense that he was really trying to figure out what happened, and not simply trying to support one position or the other. Like he didn't go in trying to prove his father had conducted a valid prosecution. Item number 2, concerns over Chester's guilt appeared to attract a number of conspiracy theorists. They generated a number of fanciful explanations for how Chester was actually innocent. They created noise that needed to be factored out in order to get to the truth. They were an unwelcome distraction during the production of the documentary. Item number 3, it was amazing at how divided the community was as far as Chester's culpability. Many residents were 100% positive he was guilty, and many were 100% positive he was innocent. There were not a lot of people who were still weighing both sides of the case. Most people had decided one way or the other. Item number 4, the order in which the facts were presented in the documentary and the degree to what information was supplied at various points made the documentary a little too choppy. I understand the idea of building suspense. The filmmaker didn't want to give away everything in the beginning, but this case was actually fairly straightforward. It would have been nice to have a compressed narrative of the facts and then look at some of the more speculative elements. Also, I felt as though there was a lot of unnecessary interviewing. There were many people who were just saying how they were sure that Chester was guilty or innocent, and they weren't really discussing anything concrete. Sometimes these peripheral accounts and speculation can be interesting, but the documentary explored this area too extensively, to the point of wasting time. Overall, I think it was an okay documentary, but not well organized. The results for DNA testing will be available in 2022, so maybe there will be another update for this case in the future. Those are my thoughts on the murders at Starved Rock. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.